Hi, I'm Phil, and welcome to another series of Engaged in Conversation. Today, we're going to be focusing on something very interesting, which is the art of storytelling in a business capacity. We all know that if you tell a story, it's more engaging and more memorable. And when you're looking at interactions between your colleagues or between your customers and your colleagues, it's really powerful to collect those stories and share them through the organisation and beyond. The question is, how do we do that in an effective way? Well, today we're going to give you the answer to that. I'm joined by a storytelling guru, Andrew Thorp, who's going to share his expertise and wisdom in how we deliver an effective story. Andrew, welcome to the studio today. Thank you very much for coming. I'd probably describe you as the person that has really helped craft the art of storytelling in business, something that many people have heard about, but it's a skill that's hard to do, I think. So it's great for you to come and share your insights today. And I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about what storytelling means in business and how you can improve it.
No, it's great to be here, Phil. I'm delighted to share some insights.
So the audience may not know, but we've worked together over recent months, and you have a particularly fascinating skill set which we wanted to utilise ourselves, but it really got me thinking about the value of it in terms of engagement generally for organisations. As you know, we specialise in fostering engagement across the audiences that matter most for a business. So typically their colleagues, their customers, and getting wider communities engaged on their brand. And you have a fantastic skill set around the art of storytelling. Would you like to share with us that sort of expertise and how that came about?
And just thinking about what you're saying there, I think the skill, whatever it is that you think I have, is to do with connection skills. Because it isn't just about broadcasting something that's nicely framed and sounds more elegant. It's about whether it lands and resonates with the audience. So I think what I actually teach people or help people with is connection skills. But it's usually through the medium of verbal communication. So I call it verbal PR. And it basically means that when you open your mouth, something interesting comes out which somehow resonates with the people you're trying to connect with. So for the most part, I help people frame their message in a different way. And it started actually in a very, very odd way because I come from an apparently unrelated industry, which is the golf industry. And you think, well, how on earth do you move from golf to this? What's the connection? But for me, it's public speaking. So I worked for 22 years in the golf and leisure industry in the UK in a variety of roles as a journalist, as a marketing manager, a general manager, a golf coach, because my brother's a golf professional, so I was considering a similar avenue. But then I changed direction about 13 years ago, probably in my mid to late 40s, and decided that the common thread, what I wanted to continue doing from the golf industry, was public speaking. Because if you love it, and very few people do, and I do, there's oodles of opportunity to do it in the golf industry because of all the prize givings and ceremonies associated with the sport. So I set out to become a professional speaker and then realised that it's quite tough to earn a living initially. So I helped people present better in business because there's a sort of an enduring need for relief from death by PowerPoint. But it wasn't just, the nerves and the anxiety that people were suffering with that was problematic for them. It was that what they had to say wasn't as interesting as it could be. They didn't have a story. It was very dry, it was very factual, it was rather cold and transactional. And it informed the audience, but it didn't move them. There was nothing in there that inspired them. It was very dry and cold. So I set about, first of all, helping them to craft a better message, if typically they represented an organisation where there was a product, a service, and also the ethos and the culture of the business needed to be communicated because people would then see them as somebody worth dealing with, or I like the sound of them. Not just as a potential client, but also as an employee as well. I'd like to work for a company like that because I like the vibe that's coming across in the story that's being told about them. So that's kind of the genesis of all of this. It came about from helping people present better on a formal stage, but then it's expanded into every form of verbal and written, but mostly verbal communication.
And what would you say the main use cases for this advice is being pointed at?
Well, initially, as I said, it was about when they were on a stage. So typically they would be projecting a message to an audience on a public platform of some kind, to introduce themselves to the audience, to raise awareness of what they did and who they were. But I think in recent years, it's also been about what happens on the inside of an organisation, because you have a storytelling challenge internally as well, where the vision, the values, the mission, the purpose of the organisation, I call it the big picture stuff, needs to resonate with the workforce, because the way that the leaders see the company might not be the way that the workforce sees it, and there's a disconnect. So you have this very interesting relationship between the macro message, which comes from the top, so to speak, but the micro stories that come from the coalface, and they need to illustrate that you're living out those values, that sense of purpose. But often there is a disconnect. The two levels within the organisation see things very differently.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and we see that from both sides of those audiences, because we see corporate head office type functions that with the challenge of portraying those classically kind of top-down messaging to the staff, and then also enabling the staff to have a voice and communicate to their peer group and upwards through the organisation with their typically more informal social media-esque messaging, which inherently is often more engaging because it's coming from within, it's coming from the people. And so I think there is an interesting joining of the two. And I think there is an opportunity for many organisations to improve that capability for sure.
I think you also get people working in silos within that coalface area where they don't necessarily see how their work connects with other silos, that in turn is in service to that big idea. So there's lots of connection that needs to be done internally as well as just connecting with an external audience.
So can you think of some good examples where you've advised organisations or individuals to improve that?
Yeah, I worked for a while for, they're actually a schoolwear company. They provide school uniform for many, many schools across the UK. And typically in retail and customer-facing situations, you're looking for good stories from the coalface. But sometimes the managers who send in one of those stories where one of their staff has done something really good doesn't do justice to what was actually done, because the story wasn't told very well. It was very surface level. So occasionally you have to dig down a little bit and become like a journalist and interview the person who's the subject of the story and actually drill down and find out what actually happened and why, therefore, what they did was really good. So if, for example, in one case, one of the young members of staff, I think he was a summer student who worked in one of the stores, helped a young boy who was concerned about his body shape, put it that way. And this young man, the summer student, calmed him down and found some kind of bond and connection with this boy because he himself had an autistic brother and he'd had to learn to communicate with him in a particular way and connect with him. And he was also doing a psychology degree at university. But neither of those two pieces of information were given to me initially, and therefore the story was a little flat. It was okay, but it was a bit flat. And then at the end of the interaction with the little boy, the mother came over to the summer student and said, "The way that you dealt with it, do you know what? I wish if I ever had another child, I wish he'd be like you." And he went bright red.
Wow.
And then the tears started to flow. So the story that was done they didn't do justice to it with the bare details that were sent initially. And then when the story was retold in the enhanced form, then it really hit home.
And I think that's really interesting because many of us lose the ability or don't have the ability to sort of step away and look out, look back in on something, especially for yourself. And you have that great skill of questioning and drawing out those additional elements that you've just exampled there.
And I think it's similar, Phil, to journalists or observational comedians who are always on the lookout for stories. they have mental antennae that are always twitching. And one of the phrases I use with people is you build your library. You're always having to be hoovering up stories, but people don't always see the story. Stuff happens to them, but they don't see, oh, I could use that. That's interesting. So I have a process which I coach people through of being curious, of hoovering up things, figuring out what the angle might be of what they could make of it, to make perhaps a point about leadership or customer service or employee engagement, and then practice telling it, but in a safe setting. I'll often be found walking or running in the hills talking to myself, but I'm actually practicing a story. I'm sad that way. And then once you're confident with it, then you can roll it out and start using it in a public situation where you really have to, to nail it. So that's like a process. And it isn't just stories. Your library is things like analogies, metaphors, models for explaining things. Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs would be an example of a model to explain something. And I have a few models as well that I've developed. They're all in the library, and you pull them out when you need to. And in a sort of a formal presenting situation, I call that a PPP, a pre-prepared presentation. You might deliberately position some of these things in a set order in what you want to say, but in a conversation, it's more spontaneous. So I call this rehearsed spontaneity. So you've used that model, that metaphor, that story before, but you don't know when you're going to bring it out. Because I didn't know I was going to tell you the schoolwear the schoolwear story. And that's just a brief version of it. There's a longer version and a shorter version.
So when you engage with a new client, whether that be an executive or a leadership team or whoever, an individual, what's the process that you go through, and typically how long would that take to build up these libraries, or however you go about?
Well, it depends what the format is for delivering my input. So often I'll be asked to do workshops, so there might be a full day or a half day workshop, or if it's virtual, maybe a series of 2-hour workshops on how to use storytelling as an influencing skill. So typically they would be consultants or people who work in consulting related industries, where they have to be better at winning people over, at building their trust, getting them, the client side, to open up and tell them their story so that they can arrive at a solution. But in other situations, it might be more of a coaching relationship, whereby I'm working with maybe the CEO or some of the senior salespeople to help develop their material so that they're then able to use it either in that pre-prepared sense or in these more spontaneous, conversational situations. So it depends on what the client wants in terms of the delivery of the training or the input.
But typically, how long might that take? Would it be 1-2 sessions, or would you do a program where you can allow people to go away, do some homework, and then draw upon these stories? Because that's part of the process. Presumably, it's not just going to happen in a couple of hours.
No, you can't learn storytelling in a day.
No.
Somebody once said you don't learn how to ride a bicycle in a day, or at a seminar. You've got to practice it over time. So the frustration when you're delivering workshops is you may never see those people again, and you don't know what they go and do with it. So working with individuals over a number of weeks on, say, a run of coaching sessions is a better way of doing it, because you see them progress. But you've got to space the sessions apart, a bit like when I used to teach golf. You can't have a golf lesson the day after the first one because you haven't had time to practice. But you don't want to come back a month later because you'll have forgotten what you were meant to do the first time around, and other stuff's got in the way. So you really need to have maybe a two-week gap or 3-week gap between sessions, and then I'll give them homework to be doing in the meantime. So, for example, they might want a better way of introducing themselves, or they might want a better way of pitching their business in 5 minutes, and produce some slides which I can then evaluate and suggest some changes to.
It's a fascinating area, and I think we're always looking for ways to improve the connection. I like that word that you used before, because ultimately that's a big part of engagement, isn't it? If you're connecting individuals together, then the message will resonate. And I look at, what's your take on how good do you think organisations are generally on facilitating the art of that?
Well, if I introduce a model to you now, I mentioned models before from the library, I have one called the 3-layered cake. So you have your top layer, which I call the big picture. So that typically will be your vision, your values, your sense of purpose, and so forth. That's the conceptual glue that holds everything together that you're doing in the company. Then you have your machinery layer, which is the nuts and bolts, the factual framework of, where you're based, how many staff you have, what do you sell, how much does it cost, how do you deliver it, that kind of thing. But on its own, it's dry. It's factual, it's useful information and probably necessary, but if that's all you talk about, very dry. And then the lower layer is the library, as I've mentioned before, all those little sort of nuggets of wisdom that you can pull out when you need to. So I think that the really good communicators move up and down the three layers. There's elements of each in their message. And if you look at something like a TED Talk, for example, a TED Talk will often start with something from the library. They'll start with 5 years ago, I walked into a bar. And immediately you're intrigued, where's this going? This sounds interesting. And then they'll hook the audience with that. And then they'll say, and I mentioned this story because I think that experience in that bar, to me, illustrates what's wrong or good about our organisation. And then they'll go to the big picture. So you go library, big picture. So they see the broader context of what that story means. And then you'll go into the machinery layer and maybe explain this is how it's been working in a pilot project we've been running in our Manchester office. So you go library, big picture, machinery. That's a nice sequence to go through. Just to finish answering your question, I think most people I work with are perfectly capable of describing the machinery layer because it's tangible, factual, close to what they do every day. They're not terribly good at the conceptual layer because it's a bit fluffy and big picture stuff and can be a bit vacuous and meaningless to people on the ground. And they're usually terrible at the library layer because loads of stuff has happened to them. They're doing great things in the organisation, but they can't pull something out and describe it really nicely in a condensed way, but nonetheless doing justice to the story. So they're very good at the middle one, not so good at the top two and the bottom one.
I suppose it's like anything, isn't it? It becomes an acquired skill that you master over time, and the more, certainly something like public speaking, the more you do it, the better you'll get. Well, maybe not though, right? Because you can do something badly for a long time as well. So
there's a saying, isn't there? We use this in the golf industry, that people say practice makes perfect, but actually practice makes permanent because you ingrain bad habits if you're practicing the same thing. So perfect practice makes perfect.
So you using the golf analogy a lot. Is that something do you still play? Do you still have time to?
I do play a little bit, not nearly as much as I used to. Yeah, but I don't know. As I've got older, I've got less competitive about wanting to play well. Because I did play to a reasonable level as an amateur, and it's quite hard to play now not very well because you remember what you ought to be like. But no, I'm interested in other things now. I'm interested in people. I really have a fascination for people and for stories and for ways of humanising what can otherwise be very cold corporate language, which just doesn't connect with people.
No, and I think you can clearly see there's a natural affinity with sport and business, and that's used a lot, isn't it? And people relate to it because they like sport.
Yes.
And sports personalities are it's almost easy for them because they're very well known. They have usually a fascinating story to tell as well about how they've achieved the things they've achieved. And in business, you see the same. You see a lot of figurehead type people that have a fascinating story to tell. So it's arguably easier for them to do that. But your average person that might think, well, I don't have that lifestyle, I don't have that type of a success behind me. How do I tell a story that's of interest? I think that's the fascinating bit for me.
I think what you've seen certainly in the media in recent years is more of an interest in the small stories of ordinary people as opposed to the celebrity people, the very well-known public figures. So you have the Listening Project on BBC Radio 4, which I really like listening to, where they just had a little recording studio and two people, maybe a mother and a son, sit in the recording studio and just share stuff. And it's recorded and broadcast, and it's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And many people will say to me, well, I don't really have any stories. I just lead a very humdrum existence. Nothing happens to me. But it does. But they choose not to see it, perhaps because they don't want to be in the limelight. They may be feeling that it's they don't want to be the centre of attention, and they deflect. or opt out. But actually, when someone like myself sits down with them, I'll find things in their story which are absolutely fascinating, which they never thought were of interest to anybody. And actually, they've often forgotten about them themselves.
I think that's the thing that can have an impact. Certainly did for me when you did the process for me.
Yeah.
It was quite profound. There were areas where I thought, gosh, I'd never made those connections between this event and that event. And it was really enlightening to go through that process at an individual level.
And things like in job interviews where you're often asked, well, tell me about your values, what do you believe in, you know. You can say things like, well, I believe in fairness and justice and integrity and authenticity, but why? That's the interesting question. Where do those values come from? And it's often because of an experience someone's had that's been a formative experience, or an upbringing, or a parent or a mentor, you know, someone they really admired, that's shaped them in some way. That's very interesting. But again, the individual often hasn't reflected on that. They're just used to trotting off the line that, oh, I believe in fairness. But the why and where does it come from digs down, and then you get a sort of under the bonnet, so to speak. Or under the hood for our American listeners.
Yes. I think there's a huge increase in people's intrigue around the individual, and through the COVID years especially, we've gone from an environment where, you know, us Brits have been typically that sort of stiff upper lip, quite sort of private people, and so we don't necessarily engage and connect at an individual, a human level, telling our most sort of personal stories with people. I think the last couple of years, a lot of that shifted, and the environment is much more open now. And I think part of the challenge is getting organisations to have a culture that enables that to take place.
I think people are worried about showing vulnerability. And I would recommend your listeners check out Brené Brown's TED Talk about vulnerability, which is beautiful. And vulnerability, I guess, if you're in a leadership or a senior position, you have to handle carefully, because you don't want it to undermine people's respect for you. So it's not a case of just sharing everything, you know, putting all your dirty laundry out there for public view. It's about choosing to reveal something that people can therefore see you as a human being, but nonetheless they still see you in a respectful way, because they admire what you've achieved. They can see that you're a solid individual, you're confident, but perhaps there's something behind that sheen of perfection that they can see behind and think, oh, you know, he is vulnerable, he is capable of error. And I think they can warm to you then.
Do you think we have a culture in the UK that likes to find those vulnerabilities to the point where they are errors, and almost look for people to be brought down on the basis of that?
I mean, we have this tendency in the UK to bring people down from their high horse if they're very, very successful. Definitely. But there's an interesting concept in public speaking called status management, whereby if you're asked to speak on a public platform, there is necessarily an imbalance of status because you know something that the audience doesn't, because that's why you're there. But you can't keep it high, because they'll start to think, well, he's above us, you know, he's talking down to us. So often you'll bring it down a bit with maybe a little bit of self-deprecation to them, so they think, well, he's like us, he's capable of doing something daft. But then you've got to bring it up again to justify your time on the stage and the time they've given to listen to you. But I'll give you a very quick example of this. I gave a talk in Bucharest in Romania a few years ago at a marketing conference, and the guy before me was brilliant. And I was thinking, oh, no, I'm going to follow him.
Yeah.
And he opened with a lovely little story. He said, the other day, my 8-year-old boy came up to me and he said, Dad, we've got to bring your dad to school day coming up. And we've got to tell everybody in the school what our dads do for a job. What is it you actually do again at work all day? And he's like, I puffed out my chest and said, well, I'm a brand strategist, son. And he said, my son looked very disappointed at me and said, well, actually, I think we've probably got enough dads coming along, thanks. And that was that. So the audience loved that. They all giggled. But then he went on to say, and it got me thinking, what is it that I actually do for a living? And I came to the conclusion that all I really do is I help organisations tell their story better. And obviously he's in a related field to me. But it was a lovely story because it brought down his status, but it didn't detract from the respect the audience had for him because he's there as a speaker and he knows some stuff clearly. But it's also nice and humble where we assume that wisdom is sent down from older people to younger people. But when you tell a story where it goes the other way, I think that's a really nice thing. So he opened brilliantly with that.
I think that's definitely a really good insight because people come at things from different angles, and gosh, when you look at social media and the way the likes of TikTok and Snapchat are being embraced by the younger generation, they're giving something back. They have a mechanism to tell a story in a way that the older generation don't. And that's really nice to see. And I think the challenge with the organisations is trying to foster the engagement across all levels of the organisation and give the right tools for those individuals to connect and be able to share their insights and their stories.
I think the internal storytelling again relates to this point that people often don't like to be the centre of attention. They don't think they're doing anything spectacular. They'll often say, well, I just do this.
Yeah.
It's often prefaced with the word just. So you've almost got to give them a belief that what they're doing really matters, and it's linked with that, and it's linked with that, and that's the stuff that we do in this organisation. It wouldn't happen without your, link in the chain. But again, the managers, I think, of those people have to get better at spotting the small stuff. Because often the individuals won't put themselves forward and say, oh, look, I did that the other day. Could you talk about it? They won't do that. So the managers have to sort of tease that out of them. But as with the schoolwear story, see the stuff that needs to be told, obviously with the permission of the subject. But that's what makes it a really lovely story from the coalface.
Yeah. Fantastic. Do you think that if you had a magic wand for an organisation, is there something that you could ideally suggest that every organisation would do? Where would you start to...
Well, they almost need an in-house journalist.
Yeah.
And there are, sometimes people are poets of residence in Heathrow Airport or something, so they are on the lookout for little stories to capture the essence of what the airport's doing, I guess, as an organisation, as a culture. So the equivalent, I guess, would be somebody in-house who's really, really good at seeing these stories, but also teasing them out of people because they've got to win the trust of the people who are subjects of those stories so that they feel safe, to be exposed in a way of that they've done that. So it is, and part of my training, I call it story listening skills, which sounds a bit counterintuitive because you think, well, actually, isn't storytelling about telling? Isn't it about you saying things? But it's actually about you, as you are doing with me, asking questions, making the person feel safe to open up, building on the answers, making the person who's speaking feel encouraged that what they're saying is meaningful and helpful. And then they start to be more forthcoming. And again, in consulting, a little bit like the analogy of the doctor-patient situation, the doctor has to make the patient feel safe to be honest with them about their lifestyle, what they're doing at the moment, and not just present them with the symptom they think they're going to describe to the doctor. And I won't tell them all the other stuff, because the doctor can't diagnose and prescribe properly unless the patient's honest and open.
We saw a great example in the media yesterday of the old lady who had to spend all day on the bus because she couldn't afford to heat her home. And that literally got the headlines and floored Boris in his tracks, didn't it, in the interview?
Yeah.
And I think that's a great example of the media finding out about the old lady who was struggling to heat her home.
Yes.
Was the story that grabbed the whole headlines. And that's
an example of the micro story being very powerful. People extrapolate a lot of meaning from a micro story. And I think with people who present data, typically they're presenting abstract information which leaves people cold, but you've got to illustrate it through little examples. And you look at wildlife documentaries, the Attenborough, the many Attenborough series, they will talk about things like climate change and environmental damage, but through the context of an individual family of creatures or a community that's been decimated by rising sea levels or whatever, and it's much more powerful then.
Yeah, if you zone in on the
I
animal.
call it zooming in and zooming out. You zoom in on a little case, an individual case, but then you zoom out and set the wider context.
So Andrew, just to be clear then, just give us an example or give us a little bit more colour on what you really mean by storytelling, because it's bandied around a lot, isn't it? Storytelling in business. Give us a bit more colour on that.
For me, it's both beneficial and problematic as a term. It's beneficial because it's kind of a sexy term. It's been around the corporate world for a few years. I often get opportunities because they've heard of the word storytelling and they search for somebody who does that kind of thing. That guy does that kind of thing. So it's great in that sense. But it's also problematic because people have a very narrow perception of what it is. Do you just help people tell funny anecdotes then? Is that it? Do you do anything else? And then you have to politely explain, well, actually, that's one element of storytelling, but it's really about how you frame a message and connect with people. So everything, I mean, a movie is a piece of storytelling. A play is a piece of storytelling. Your website's a piece of storytelling. In a more conceptual sense, it's conveying a message and a vibe about what kind of outfit you are and, you know, how you do business. An anecdote is obviously a piece of storytelling. So although an anecdote's a narrow definition of what I mean by it, it's actually very instructive, because if you get good at telling anecdotes, it actually feeds into all those other things that I've listed. It's actually a very good starting point, but it's by no means the end of what that means. And I call it applied storytelling. It's storytelling not for fluffery or to put kids to sleep at night with. It's actually the opposite. It's keeping adults awake rather than nodding off when they're listening to a dry PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, we see plenty of those bandied around, don't we?
And isn't it funny that we've been talking about death by PowerPoint for years and years and years, and there's been oodles of books written, endless workshops and YouTube clips, but it still persists to this day and keeps me busy.
So before you talked about your 3-layered cake, which makes me feel hungry, by the way, because it is nearly lunchtime, and that's fascinating because you've got the big picture stuff, you have that machinery layer, and then you had the library layer, which is almost a pyramid in my head, because I presume there's more library layers inherently than there are big picture.
Yes, it does actually get wider.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right, the lower end, because you've got multiple stories in the library layer and maybe just one coming from the top.
That's
in
it.
the big picture.
And then when I cross-section that to the audiences that we are always trying to stimulate engagement within, you've got the kind of headline level, you're looking at broader communities that you want to engage and be aware of your brand, which is almost that higher level piece. Then you've got the mainstay of the external engagement to your customers and how you enhance that through more improved messaging. And then you've got the kind of base there of the organisation, the internal engagement, which is all of the getting the troops aligned, as you touched on earlier. It seems to be a fascinating joining of that together and being able to have those aligned, those layers aligned. If you can fire up that magic, that's hugely powerful.
And again, it's about creating connection, what I said right at the start. So often my initial request from a client will be from the boss, the CEO, the MD, saying, look, I've got a presentation coming up in a month. I've heard you're good at this. Can you help me prepare? So it's one request for one piece of work with one person for one event. And then we get working together and we get chatting. And then they'll start to say, well, actually, our salespeople really ought to get involved with this because they're out there, you know, selling the company message and they're not doing it terribly well. So could we involve them as well? And then the salespeople start to gather their own sets of stories. And then the boss says, well, actually, we need to gather more sort of you call them micro stories from the workforce, from the coalface. Let's get more people involved now. Let's get the whole workforce involved in getting them to see what these small stories are. Well, initially they're managers, but then getting everybody to buy in to the process. So so it expands from it's a mission creep, I guess. It expands from that initial request into something more fundamental within the organisation. But they see the value of storytelling as a connective sort of tissue that's binding everything together. Because at the end of the day, that big picture message is the glue that holds everything together. But everybody needs to feel part of it, that their individual contributions are necessary and moving things, you know, in the right direction. And one of the quotes I remember watching was there's a company called Rackspace. They're in Texas in the UK, and Graham Weston gave a TED talk, and he said the key to an engaged workforce is that you want each individual to feel that they're a valued member of a winning team on an inspiring mission. I really love that.
I like that.
Because it's in threes, and we like things in threes.
Yeah.
So they need to be valued, so they're recognised, appreciated, and so forth. But they need to see that their efforts are moving the organisation forward successfully, hence a winning team. Because if they're valued for their work, but the whole organisation's struggling, that's problematic as well. But then on an inspiring mission means that there needs to be that higher sense of purpose, that the work I'm doing actually matters. It's making a difference in the world. My little contribution is actually part of something that really matters. And it's not just about making, a return for the shareholders. I love that model of those three things being in place.
No, I like that. By the way, I think you've mentioned a couple of times some TED Talks. What we'll do is we'll put links to those in the description of the podcast so people can go check those out, because they sound really interesting. So we talk a lot about the content pyramid, because we try and help and coach organisations with content through the organisation, and obviously we use our technology to empower that. And we've talked about cakes and whether they're layers or pyramid shapes, but I think that for me the content pyramid is such that the organisation in head office, a lot of organisations, when they're looking at the colleague engagement piece, put the onus on HQ, like a comms manager or an HR manager or a marketing manager, to say, come on, you're in charge of this. You've got to create all this magic corporate content that we then disseminate through the organisation. And actually, you tend to see that, absolutely there's a role for that. That's critical that people do that and do that well. But there's also, further down, the volume of content, the opportunity there is to get all of the staff to be thinking about creating these insights, capturing those stories, capturing those magic moments that you touched on, because then that gives the reality check to it as well.
And I think the opportunity is that you can't expect everybody at the ground level on the wider bit of the pyramid to be good at this.
No.
And you can't train all of them to be good at this. But you can train some of the middle level, the managers, to get better at spotting things at the coalface. So that's where I think you can make a difference. Rather than relying on a single comms manager, get a team of people who are trained up a bit in the middle level, who are then closer to the workforce at the base. That's good.
And I think that's one of the key takeaways that I think many of our people in the audience might relate to, because I see a lot of comms managers that feel that they have the burden on their shoulders to keep producing and keep manufacturing all of these insights and content pieces that the wider audience will engage on. And it's kind of unfair to expect that in many respects, isn't it?
Because they can't have their eyes and ears open everywhere, but
No.
the managers of the teams have their eyes and ears closer to the workforce at the coalface, the troops. But they don't necessarily have the skill yet or the acuity to spot the things that could constitute a story.
That's it. I think that's been really useful. Andrew, I could literally sit here all day and listen to your wonderful stories, as I'm sure many people could. But I'd like to say thank you very much for coming in and sharing your expertise and your stories with us today. And looking forward to continuing working with you in the future.
No, it's been my pleasure, Phil. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Engaged in Conversation. It was presented by our CEO, Phil Wedgwood. For more news and updates on Engage, visit our website at engagesolutionsgroup.com.